So one of the reasons that America did very little about the problem of widening inequality starting in the late 70s, early 1980s, is because we used three coping mechanisms that basically prevented much of the middle class and even some of the poor from acknowledging how bad it was getting. Coping mechanism number one was women into paid work in huge numbers, beginning in the late 1970s. Now, poor women had already been in paid work, but a lot of other women moved into paid work. I wish I could say it was because of these wonderful professional opportunities open to women, but that's not why most women went into paid work. Young wives, mothers went into paid work beginning in the late 70s, increasingly in the 1980s and beyond, because male wages were dropping, adjusted for inflation. It's the only way that families could keep up. But it was a coping mechanism. But we exhausted that coping mechanism. By the 80s, by the 1990s, when I became Secretary of Labor, I remember coping mechanism number two, which was everybody worked longer hours. Everybody was working longer hours. Our data, I couldn't believe the data. The data were actually showing that the typical American worker was working more than the extraordinarily industrious typical Japanese worker. And then, of course, that second coping mechanism has to be exhausted. You can't keep on working. And then we turned to the third coping mechanism that lasted a while, and that was using our homes as piggy banks. Basically, assuming that housing prices would continue to rise and getting home equity loans or using homes as collateral for loans or refinancing. And that worked for a while as well. But that third coping mechanism came to a grinding halt, or maybe I should say it popped with the housing bubble and the debt bubble in 2008. And so what we've seen since then is Americans gradually beginning to come to grips with a stark reality, which is that since the late 1970s, the median wage in the United States has barely budged, adjusted for inflation. And if you are poor, your wages have gone absolutely nowhere. In fact, if anything, they've been going downward. And we have chronic, hidden unemployment. Meanwhile, where did all the money go? Now here's where I get into trouble, because when I ask this question, and it's obviously a rhetorical question, people accuse me sometimes of being a class warrior. I am not a class warrior. I'm a class worrier. There is a difference, one letter, it makes a big, big difference. I do worry about what's happened. It's not I'm not vilifying anybody. This is not nobody's fault. But what happened was that more and more of the productive gains of society, beginning in the late 70s, went to the very top. It's not just income inequality we're talking about. Increasingly, we're talking about wealth inequality. Because income is a stream. Wealth is where the stream goes. And as that stream becomes less and less equal, then obviously the place where the stream empties into gets more and more and more unequal.